The committee meets today to receive testimony from Admiral Charles Richard, Commander of U.S. Strategic Command, or STRATCOM, and General James Dickinson, Commander of U.S. Space Command, or SPACECOM. Admiral Richard, General Dickinson, I want to thank you for your service to our nation, and I would like to extend my thanks to the men and women serving under your commands. Maintaining our nuclear deterrent and preserving our ability to operate in space are fundamental to our long-term strategic competition with Russia and China. There is a reason we have asked the commanders of STRATCOM and SPACECOM to testify together. Until 2019, Space Command was part of Strategic Command. Now, as SPACECOM stands up as an independent command, I would like to know what gaps or seams remain exposed during this transition and how they can be addressed. Much has changed since our last hearing in 2021. Russia's ongoing, unprovoked, and illegal invasion of Ukraine has shaken the international order that has maintained nuclear stability for the better part of a century. Vladimir Putin's behavior has been reckless to a dangerous degree. Just prior to its invasion, Russia conducted a large out-of-cycle nuclear exercise, and the Kremlin has since made a series of escalatory statements. Normally, Russia conducts its nuclear exercises in the fall, and the United States conducts ours afterwards in a stable, predictable fashion. Not so this year. More than ever, our nuclear deterrent, the bedrock of our national defense, is being relied upon as we witness the realities of a European conflict involving a nuclear-armed nation. In the past year, we have also seen China develop 3 missile fields in hardened silos throughout the country. This development, along with China's completion of its nuclear triad and modernization of its nuclear command, control, and communications, fundamentally changed the nature of Beijing's nuclear doctrine. We need to understand why China is undertaking this expansion, what it means for stability in the Indo-Pacific region, and how we should adjust our own nuclear deterrence to protect our nation and uphold the fundamental extended commitment to our allies. Similarly, over the past year, we gained a clearer picture of the threat we face in space, which has become a contested domain. In any future conflict, China will quickly extend its capabilities into space in a seamless fashion. Russia, for its part, acted recklessly in November by destroying a satellite in space while building up forces on the Ukrainian border. During today's hearing, we will discuss these threats and the nature of conflict we can expect in space in the years to come. In particular, General Dickinson, I would like to make sure that SPACECOM is fulfilling the space and ground functions you inherited from STRATCOM with respect to missile warning and nuclear command, control, and communications. Ensuring we can accurately warn both strategic and northern commands and our senior leadership of a missile attack on the homeland is of the utmost importance. SPACECOM is also responsible for integrating and tasking both ground and space sensors for better space situational awareness, essentially becoming DoD's sensor command. General Dickinson, I ask that you share your vision on how to integrate this myriad number of sensors, which range from radars on the ground and at sea to sensors aboard satellites. General, I would also like to know the progress that your command is making during its stand-up and how you are finding and retaining personnel with the specialized skill sets associated with SPACECOM operations. Admiral Richard, your command is undergoing an intense period of modernization that began with the ratification of the New START Treaty. This will be the 3rd modernization cycle since 1960, as parts of each leg of our triad age out. I am interested in hearing about the progress of modernizing the entire triad and the implications of altering that plan, especially with respect to our near-peer competitors. In addition, I would like to know your views on the efforts by the National Nuclear Security Administration to recapitalize its uranium and plutonium handling infrastructure. Some of these facilities date back to the Manhattan Project and are single points of failure in supporting your mission. It is essential that we understand what impacts this may have on your operations. Thank you again for appearing today, and I look forward to your testimonies. Ranking Member Inhofe cannot be here today. We anticipate he will return next week, but I would ask that his opening statement be submitted for the record, and without objection, so ordered. And I will also note for my colleagues that there will be a classified briefing immediately following this session in SVC 217, to continue our discussion. And with that, let me recognize Admiral Richards.
Chairman Reed, distinguished committee members, I am pleased to testify today with my fellow combatant commander, General Dickinson. Before I begin, given the ongoing and historically significant crisis that's happening in Ukraine right now, I'm going to need to defer all questions regarding Russia and a number of questions related to our own forces to the closed session. I want to thank Secretary Austin, Chairman Milley, for their continued support to the strategic deterrence and strategic defense of the nation, as well as their overall leadership under some very trying conditions. Ladies and gentlemen, right up front, I want to assure you that the 150,000 soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, guardians, civilians of U.S. Strategic Command, as always, are ready to execute our strategic deterrence mission. Chairman Milley rightly stated, we are witnessing one of the largest shifts in global geostrategic power the world has ever witnessed. Today, we face two nuclear-capable near peers who have the capability to unilaterally escalate to any level of violence in any domain worldwide with any instrument of national power at any time, and we have never faced a situation before like that in our history. Last fall, I formally reported to the Secretary of Defense the PRC's strategic breakout. Their expansion and modernization in 2021 alone is breathtaking, and the concern I expressed in my testimony last April has now become a reality. I have previously emphasized our need to be able to deter two adversaries at the same time. That need is now an imperative. I've said this before, and I think it's worth repeating. Every operational plan in the Department of Defense and every other capability we have rests on an assumption that strategic deterrence is holding, and in particular that nuclear deterrence is holding. If strategic or nuclear deterrence fails, no other plan and no other capability in the Department of Defense is going to work as designed. The nation's nuclear forces underpin integrated deterrence and enable the U.S., our allies, and our partners to confront aggressive and coercive behavior. The strategic security environment is now a three-party nuclear near-peer reality. Today's nuclear force is the minimum required to achieve our national strategy. Right now, I am executing my strategic deterrence mission under historic stress, crisis levels of deterrence, crisis deterrence dynamics that we've only seen a couple of times in our nation's history, and I'm doing it with submarines built in the 80s and 90s, an air-launched cruise missile built in the 80s, intercontinental ballistic missiles built in the 70s, a bomber built in the 60s, part of our nuclear command and control that predates the internet, and a nuclear weapons complex that dates back to the Manhattan era. We must modernize the nuclear triad, the NC3, the nuclear weapons complex, and supporting infrastructure to meet presidential objectives. And while modernization must be the priority, please make no mistake, STRATCOM's forces are ready today. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Admiral. General Dickinson, please.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you, Chairman Reed and members of the Senate Armed Services Committee. As always, I am honored today to represent the approximately 18,000 men and women of United States Space Command. We are a joint and diverse team of professionals who value the honorable service of everyone within our ranks. Today, we are not only in full support of our joint forces globally and NATO in Europe, but we remain hard at work building the command toward full operational capability. We are steadily building the capability and capacity in our headquarters, and its composition reflects our joint, combined, and partnered approach to executing our critical mission. As of this month, we have over 1,000 members assigned to our headquarters, including civilians, contractors, active duty personnel from all services, representatives from the interagency, and service members from the National Guard and Reserves. We also recognize the vital importance of our allies and partners through the contributions of an assigned international general officer and 2 international liaison officers on our staff. We are pleased to have all of them on our team. Responding to the threats to the U.S. and allied interests in the space demands the teamwork and expertise of every one of our people. We are prepared to execute our Unified Command Plan missions and responsibilities, yet acknowledge that the challenges from our competitors in the domain are substantial and, in fact, growing. China remains our pacing challenge. Current PLA development is directed towards creating a joint, versatile, professional, and lethal force capable of power projection globally, and the space layer is critical to their efforts. In 2021, the PRC increased on-orbit assets by 27%. This increase brings their on-orbit satellite total from just over 100 satellites 10 years ago to more than 500 satellites today. Their recent counter space capability demonstrations include the DN-1 and the DN-2 direct descent anti-satellite tests and a hypersonic glide vehicle test. In October of 2021, the PRC launched their SJ-21 satellite, described as a, quote, space debris mitigation, end quote, satellite. In January, the SJ-21 docked with a defunct PRC satellite and moved it to an entirely different orbit. This activity demonstrated potential dual-use capability in SJ-21 interaction with other satellites and builds on the previous demonstrations in late 2016 of potential dual-use capability that we saw in the SJ-17. Over the past 2 weeks, we have witnessed Russian aggression in Europe on a significant scale. Space is not a sanctuary from similar behavior. Russia is actively working to regain its prestige as a space power. The destructive direct ASAT test just this last November is an example of their activity. Space is no longer a sanctuary, and U.S. Space Command stands ready to protect and defend the space assets of the United States and our partners and allies. U.S. Space Command is committed to deterring the use of any space capabilities for nefarious purposes within the framework of the Department of Defense Integrated Deterrence Strategy. Key to all of this is U.S. and allied space superiority informed through space domain awareness, or SDA, capabilities. SDA helps us analyze, not just identify, what is occurring in space, which, when combined with the information from our intelligence agency, helps develop an understanding of why things are happening, characterize intent, and provide decision advantages to our leaders. Our SDA capabilities are part of a broader resilient space architecture that enables command and control and provides the tools to sustain freedom of action in the space domain. Within this broader resilient space architecture, SDA remains my top mission priority for U.S. Space Command. SDA provides the backbone of U.S. Space Command's strategy for accomplishing our mission. That strategy sets the conditions to understand and attribute activities in space. This enables our mission to deter first and, when called upon, to defend space capabilities and deliver combat power for the United States and our allies. Our strategy has three main areas of focus. First, countering competitive influence. Second, strengthening relationships and attracting new partners. And third, building and maintaining a competitive edge. With continued support from Congress, U.S. Space Command will do all of that and more. U.S. Space Command is postured to protect and defend the space domain while ensuring continuous space effects are delivered to our joint and combined force. I assure you here today that U.S. Space Command is ready. So, on behalf of the most critical resource in our command, the soldiers, Marines, sailors, airmen, guardians, civilians, and families of the command, thank you, Chairman Reed, and members of this committee for your support of our mission to conduct operations in, from, and to space. I submit my statement for the record, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, General Dickinson. And Admiral Richard, I concur with your assessment that we should reserve questions regarding Ukraine and Russia to the closed session, so I will do that. But let me begin with a question regarding the modernization of the triad and also the capabilities at the National Nuclear Security Administration. You've said in the past that we're at a point of no return. So can you please elaborate a bit, particularly with respect to Minuteman III ICBMs and the pit production capability at NNSA?
Chairman, one, I'm pleased to report, based on what services and agencies are reporting, that the overall recapitalization of the triad is on track. no margin is left. But right now, all of those programs are proceeding the way that is necessary for them to deliver capability on time to meet my requirements. The weapons complex is a different story. And we have crossed one of those points of no return that I referred to previously, in that we now know we will not get 80 pits per year by 2030 as is statutorily required, and even unlimited money at this point will not buy that back. So there is active work underway inside the Nuclear Weapons Council to understand exactly how much of a delay we are going to have, how much of it can be addressed by funding. A fundamental question we have to answer to Congress is to certify NNSA's budget. And I want to make another point here, which is we're not mitigating this problem. We have shot all the mitigation to get us to this point. It's the fourth time the nation has tried to recapitalize its pit production infrastructure. Now the question becomes, how much damage have we done, and what are the consequences of that? And we're working to better understand that, sir.
Thank you very much, Admiral. Also, we're working on a nuclear posture review, and I know you're deeply involved in that, and a key element is our declaratory policy. What is our intention in terms of use, in terms of our strategy? What's your assessment of our extended deterrence commitment to our allies, particularly in light of the current hostilities, and any perception of changes in the declaratory policy?
Senator, what I'll offer that I have testified to this committee and others as to my recommendations with regard to possible changes to declaratory policy. Those have not changed. That was a part of my input into the nuclear posture review. As you know, that ultimately will be decided by the President. We received very clear feedback from the allies in terms of their opinion and the harmful effects on extended deterrence and assurance that changes would have. That's one factor of many to be considered. I do think right now we're getting a very vivid example, real world, of the importance of extended deterrence and assurance, that if we want our allies to assist us in standing up to aggression, we have to provide that assurance to them such that they're in a position to go after our mutual goals.
Thank you, Admiral. General Dickinson, in some respects, you've been promoted to Sensor Command as well as Space Command, because one of your first major tasks is to link sensors both in space, on the Earth, and below the seas. Can you give us an idea of what it will take to perform this integration and where you might be now?
Thank you, Chairman. So we have made a lot of progress over the last 2.5 years with identifying and incorporating sensors that we traditionally did not use for space domain awareness, missile warning, or missile defense in the global perspective. And we've really identified radars such as TPY-2s around the world, as well as BMD ships afloat and Aegis Ashore sites as well. And our goal is to link these sensors together from a terrestrial perspective. We add to those, we add the UEWRs that we've traditionally used for NC3 around the world for early warning, and brought all those terrestrial capabilities to bear, if you will, in terms of understanding what we see in the space domain. In addition to that, we're linking our space-based assets, in addition to that, bringing them into a common operating picture. We still have work to be done with regards to that, but we've made some good progress over the last 2.5 years, and we're working towards that to the ultimate piece where we have one operating picture that has those sensors fused into it. And that really kind of pulls in some of the work that the Department of the Air Force is doing with JADC2 and some of those ABMS efforts that are going on right now. And as you can imagine, Chairman, that has a massive data burden, if you will, that has to be properly synthesized, properly organized, making sure that it's cyber protected so that you have a database and you have information that is authoritative and available at the speed of relevance.
So the backbone of the system is constant, uninterrupted, encrypted communication between all your assets. Is that one way to look at it?
That's one way to look at it, yes, Chairman.
And are we getting there?
We're getting there. we're getting there, and like I said, those are sensors that many of those sensors, TPY-2s, BMD, Aegis BMD ships, those sensors traditionally weren't required or expected to have a capability looking up in the space domain. But what we're finding out is those exquisite radars do have capability, and what capability we need to add to that, we're identifying those gaps and requirements now at U.S. Space Command, and then putting that demand signal back onto those specific assets.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. Senator Wicker, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and General Dickinson and Admiral Richard, thank you very much for your service on a very, very vital part of our national defense strategy. Admiral Richard, the United States is currently engaged in negotiations with Iran on the Iran nuclear deal. Can you tell me, are you being consulted about those negotiations?
Senator, I'm not, and that's appropriate, right? My forces don't play a role in terms of where that treaty and our overall desire to avoid Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. So
your experience in making our nuclear policy work is not deemed important to those who are negotiating how we go forward with Iran?
Senator, as you know, I don't enter into treatments or agreements. That's a Department of State function. What I do is provide technical expertise. For example, I had my deputy commander as a part of the New START treaty negotiation team so that team had immediate access to any operational implications of what they were doing. While I'm certainly available to do the same thing for those negotiations, currently that's not needed.
Okay, well, I may not get an answer to this question, but it's a question that's on the minds of Americans today. We are told with relative certainty that the talks are going on and that Russia is a part of the nuclear discussions between the United States and Iran about re-entering this nuclear deal. Let me just say, Russia is led by the dictatorship and the kleptocracy of Vladimir Putin, a serial international war criminal. And it is astonishing to me that they would be anywhere near the negotiating room in a process that might lead us to making concessions to Iran that we would not otherwise have made. You probably don't want to comment on that, I guess, Admiral.
Senator, what I would look forward to commenting in the closed session is an overall assessment of threats to the nation and how we're going to defend and deter against those.
Okay, let me leave it at that. But I would simply say, Mr. Chairman, and my colleagues and to my fellow Americans, that it is highly troubling, I think, to most Americans, that Vladimir Putin would have anything at all to say about any decision the United States would make about what is best for our people and our national security, considering the fact that he is, without a doubt, a serial war criminal. The distinguished ranking member of this committee, Mr. Chairman, has suggested a question or two, which I would like to submit on his behalf. Russia has a nuclear arsenal larger and more modern than the United States, and currently threatened nuclear escalation during the invasion of Ukraine. Admiral Richard, we've heard for a long time how critical it is that we rebuild our nation's nuclear deterrent, but we're still years away from fielding any new systems. How important is it that we accelerate the U.S. nuclear modernization plan as quickly as possible?
Senator, I'd offer 3 points on that, and again can go into more detail in the closed session. It is very clear that the absolute minimum that we need to do is to recapitalize the triad, the nuclear command and control, and the nuclear weapons complex. But there's 2 other questions we need to be asking ourselves along the way with that. The threats are changing in a way that we have not seen in 30 years. We do not know the endpoints of where either of those other 2 are going, either in capability or capacity. We're just now starting to work out what 3-party stability looks like, what 3-party deterrence dynamics works out. On top of that, we are learning a number of lessons in real time on how actual crisis deterrence works. It is different from steady state deterrence that most of us have experience in. Those 2 questions, I think, need to be asked much more frequently than we have needed to in the past, followed with what is the capability, capacity, and posture we require from our strategic forces moving forward.
And Mr. Chairman, if you would indulge me for another moment with regard to a question that the ranking member has asked repeatedly and which deserves to be asked today. Admiral Richard, you have testified that you do not believe it is in the national interest of the United States to change our policy with regard to no first use or sole purpose nuclear declaratory policy. Would you explain why that has been, and is it still your position?
Senator, I have testified to that. My position is unchanged. That, of course, will be decided along with a number of other factors, and we'll see what the answer is in the nuclear posture review. But fundamentally, I can go in a lot longer answer, but it's one, your adversaries won't believe you, so it doesn't enhance deterrence in any way. But your allies will believe you, and it's highly corrosive to your extended deterrence and assurance commitments.
Thank you, Madam. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Worker. Senator Gillibrand, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. General Dickinson, I'm concerned that our lack of international agreements barring conventional weapons in space has led to a space arms race that threatens our civil and commercial systems in space. How much of a role is SpaceCom playing in developing international norms about the use of weapons in space?
Thank you, Senator, for the question. So in my job as the SpaceCom commander, I work very closely with the Department of Defense, in particular the policy folks in the Department of Defense in terms of working through those types of issues. What I have been charged to do is by the Secretary of Defense back in July was he gave me a memo that outlined the 5 tenets of responsible behavior for the Department of Defense. And so right now we're working through how we implement that within the department. But to your point is that with those tenets become our base plate, if you will, that we talk with the Department of Defense, and then subsequently they start talking with the Department of State. So we have a kind of an indirect role that we start kind of from the combatant command up through the department. In that regard. But those tenets of responsible behavior, there are 5 of them, and I think they're very good in terms of outlining what we would expect not only for the Department of Defense in terms of responsible behavior, but for our allies and partners, and we've had a lot of good discussions on that in several different forums.
Given the lack of codified norms in space, what, in your view, constitutes an armed attack in the domain, and how would you deal with a proportionate response?
Well, Senator, I would say that, these tenets, I think, outline kind of what we would think as responsible behavior in space. And as we look through that, how do we make sure that we are able to understand what that, I think the first thing we have to look at is how well can we understand what's happening in the space domain. As I mentioned in my opening remarks, my #1 priority for the commander, top priority, is to be able to increase my space domain awareness so I can interpret and understand what those norms of behavior or those tenets are in space.
The Valley of Death in acquisition references the transition from innovative small-scale projects to full-scale funded programs, which is often studded with budget challenges, risk mitigation, and integration problems leading to immense waste. Innovative technology and the ability to quickly field the warfighter in space is critical to matching China's competencies. In your view, is the use of other transaction agreements or OTAs by the DoD being effectively implemented? And do we need more emphasis on non-federal acquisition regulation contracting solutions?
So, Senator, in my role right now, I'm a customer, if you will, for for the United States Space Force and some other agencies, and I would categorize myself as a demanding customer. And I think we have to move very quickly in terms of building new and better capabilities for the space domain. And so I know that the Space Force and the Department of the Air Force are looking right now in terms of how do they streamline those processes in order to deliver capabilities to me on a much faster timeline.
Thank you. Admiral Richard, JADC2, over the past several years, DoD has worked on developing JADC2 architecture to speed sensor to shooter responses and integrate communications across the services. In your view, how should DoD prioritize competing communications requirements for its future work, and what role, if any, will artificial intelligence play in future non-nuclear command and control decision-making systems?
Senator, I'd like to point out that, one, I am responsible for nuclear command and control from an operations requirements and systems integration piece. And in that responsibility, I am very familiar with what JADC2 is doing in conventional command and control. And in fact, was very pleased that a subset of what JADC2 is doing is for nuclear command and control. The two systems have to be overlapped to a great extent so that we can have integration. And so we are headed in the right path to make sure we take full advantage of the investments we're making in conventional command and control, while recognizing that certain portions of nuclear command and control have to serve at a higher standard than we ask regular command and control, and making sure we identify those and meet those requirements.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Senator Gillibrand. Senator Tuberville, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for being here today with all the problems going on. General Dickinson, Space Command is designated a geopolitical command. How do you plan to synchronize efforts with other geographic commands in a time of conflict? I mean, I'm sure you've worked on that.
Thank you, Senator. Absolutely. We do that every day. In particular, we've exercised it through many different exercises over the last couple of years. I think we've had 5 major exercises. But to your point, we do that each and every day. And the way we do that is when U.S. Space Command stood up in 2019, we identified a gap, if you will, within each of the combatant commands in terms of space expertise. And so one of the first things we did as we stood up was we immediately started putting what we call Joint Integrated Space Teams, or GISTs, within each of the combatant commands. And we kind of started out with INDOPACOM, EUCOM, CENTCOM, when we're working through the other 10 combatant commands now. But these elements, at the beginning, we thought would have a planning-only function within these commands. What we found out through day-to-day operations, then through exercises and real-world events, is that it's more than just planning. It's planning, it's operations, it's intelligence, it's the integration of those capabilities within each of the combatant commands that provides that regional combatant commander space expertise and the ability to leverage the space domain in order to meet their requirements for their either day-to-day operations or their op plans.
Thank you. Pretty complex, especially being new. Admiral, last year you said, quote, "For the first time in history, the nation is facing 2 potential strategic peer nuclear capable adversaries at the same time. But our nuclear posture, my understanding, has been not about 2 threats. So in your best military advice, should the U.S. consider changes to the size of its nuclear force in order to account for having now 2 peer threats?"
Senator, first, I've already repostured it, and I'll be happy to give you some details of what we've done in the closed session. The answer is yes, right? We do not necessarily have to match weapon for weapon, right? The key is, do you have enough capability to execute your strategy? But it's clear that what we have today is the absolute minimum, and we're going to have to ask ourselves, what additional capability, capacity, and posture do we need to do based on where the threat is going? It's not all strategic. There is a significant class of theater threats that we're going to have to rethink potentially how we deter that. You have to deter them all the time. I don't get the luxury of having a priority to one and lesser to the other. You have to do them all at the same time. And we're learning a number of lessons in crisis dynamics because we've had so few times in our history we've been in that those will need to be applied too, sir.
How does the hypersonic missile, now that we're seeing online, how does that change us in terms of your thoughts on the time frame of a threat, how quick we have to respond?
I look at hypersonics in two ways. One is the threat that it presents to us, and that fundamentally is a warning problem. In fact, the chairman mentioned seams opening up with the establishment of Space Command. Actually, it has worked the exact opposite of that. It mentioned the sensor commander, which is what I like to call it. Technically in DoD, it's sensor manager, but sensor commander sounds better. The way Jim is integrating across missile defense, missile warning, and space situational awareness, he's producing a better outcome than what we had in the past, and I'm actually getting a better service because of his efforts in that. That's defensive. Offensive, I will be ready to put online the first day any service makes it available a hypersonic capability. I have work for it right now. We've had requirements dating back 2016 and earlier, and I will put that to good use the first day any service makes it available in defense of the nation.
Thank you. Now that we do have hypersonics, just for my information, I'm sure we're changing protocol for our president, because it takes a pretty good while to get all the factors done to get to a point where the president can make a decision. Please tell me we are changing those protocols to answer a first attack.
Senator, one, I think it will be important that as a hypersonic capability comes into the Department of Defense, that we not label it as strategic or theater or tactical. We already have examples of platforms. My bombers are an example. I can use it strategically down one command and control and decision path like you talked about. I can use them conventionally down another. I can give them to a geographic combatant commander for that commander's use. And I think we're going to want an equivalent flexible command and control structure for hypersonics.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Tuberville. Senator King, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Before beginning my questions, I wanted to respond to Senator Wicker. We have a national interest in Iran not obtaining a nuclear weapon. Russia has a national interest in Iran not obtaining a nuclear weapon. If in this particular case we have an identity of interest, it would seem to me it makes sense to have both parties at the table. We're not negotiating with Russia, we're negotiating with Iran. And if they can add weight to those negotiations, as they did in the initial negotiations, it seems to me that serves our national interest. Let me turn to General Dickinson. ISR is very important generally, but let's talk. I want to talk about a war that's not in Ukraine. It's the war that's killing our people in Maine, two a day, and I refer to the international trade in narcotics. The question is, do we have sufficient space assets that can provide ISR and monitoring of drug shipments that can assist us in interdicting those drug shipments and preventing the death of our people? This is a war that's killing Americans in a large number every single day. And to say we can't afford to watch what's going on with those shipments, particularly from Latin America and the Caribbean, it seems to me as a dereliction of our duty to defend the country.
Senator, I would say up front, I would say that's a little bit maybe out of my purview as a combatant commander in the Department of Defense. However, I would say to you that watching to answer your question, I think when you look at the explosion in the commercial market in terms of ISR, and quite frankly, some of the things that we've just seen in the Ukraine situation over the last couple of weeks with regards to, if you watch, we're all watching TV, we see those images. You know, many of those, if not all of those, are coming from a commercial company. And so what's interesting is how much that commercial market has expanded, exploded, if you will, to provide us additional capabilities. And so, in other words, I think we have a big enough commercial market that can satisfy that demand signal. And really, for us in U.S. Space Command, with that augmentation, we're able to use our military type of ISR assets to do some other things.
I hope you're right, but the word that disturbed me in your answer was one of your first words, which was not in my purview. That's my problem. It doesn't seem to be in anybody's purview. We've got DEA, we've got DHS, we've got the military, and we've got we got people dying. And I would hope that you would consider discussing this question. To me, if this were an attack by another adversary on our country that was killing thousands of people a day, it would be within your purview. I'm suggesting it is within your purview, and I hope that you will review that. Let me ask a second question on your satellite capability. There's been a lot of discussion about resilience and redundancy. How are we in terms of cyber resilience, in terms of our space assets, blocking of signals, stealing of information coming from satellites?
Senator, when we stood up the command in 2019, we made a very deliberate effort to make sure that we didn't add cyber on to the equation as we grew. We built it in from the very beginning as we looked at our organization. And so from an organizational perspective, we've got cyber expertise and capabilities built within the command, and that's in particular in the headquarters. So in the headquarters that I mentioned, I've got about 1,000 people now. Within that headquarters itself, I just established my joint cyber cell within the command that is under my J3 Operations Directorate. We've got an integrated planning element from Paul Nakasone Cybercom embedded with us. And then 2 of my 5 service components are dual-hatted as not only Space Command, but also Cybercom. So that's kind of the structural piece.
I would urge you that to add to that structure a red team. Ask Paul Nakasone to attack you and see how it goes. General Richards, I would make the same suggestion. General Richard, in a few seconds I have left, a major sort of strategic question. How would we respond under our current nuclear posture to a Russian use of a tactical nuclear weapon in Ukraine?
Senator, I'd be happy to answer that question in closed session.
I thought that might be your answer, and I'll ask the question in closed session. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator King. Senator Rounds, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And gentlemen, first of all, let me begin by saying thank you for your service to our country. Admiral Richard, I'd like a clarification, if I could, with regard to Senator Gillibrand had asked a question concerning command and control, and specifically command and control between conventional weapon systems versus command and control for nuclear weapon systems. And you mentioned an overlay of the two with regard to JADC2. Could you clarify a little bit the separation between the two that I think we always try to keep between command and control of conventional versus nuclear weapon systems?
Senator, first, we don't always try to keep separation between conventional and nuclear command and control. You can't. We never have, and we will never be able to achieve that. Strategic platforms are still platforms. They have to interoperate with other platforms to accomplish their mission, even for simple deconfliction purposes. So one, we have to be able to tell an airplane where the other airplanes are, even if they're not on a similar mission. So you have to have some overlap to do that. 2, it is to our benefit, where appropriate, to use our conventional command and control to add redundancy and resiliency to our nuclear command and control. You couldn't afford to build 2 completely separate systems if we tried to achieve that in the real world. The final piece, though, there is always a piece of nuclear command and control that has to go to a higher standard. Nuclear command and control has to be able to withstand the worst threats that we can postulate against it. Regular command and control doesn't, and that's why we separate it out. We've always done that, and we're going to do it to an appropriate degree going into the future.
The reason for my question with regard to clarification is that I know that we're very sensitive to where other nations may try to impact our ability to command and control our nuclear weapons systems. We have the same concern about interacting with other nations' command and control. Can you talk a little bit about the clarification between the two in terms of the interest in making sure that others aren't put on alert because it appears that we're impacting theirs, and the same reason that we would have a concern about them impacting our ability, and what that does with regard to stability?
Senator, first, I think it's important that I say here, and I'd be happy to go into a lot more detail in closed session, because of the, I would call it apprehension and valid concern over the security of our nuclear command and control, particularly the cybersecurity, is our nation's nuclear command and control has never been in a stronger, more protected, more resilient lineup than it is today, based on some very good work operationally done over the last 6 to 8 months, and I would love to go into more detail as to why I say that. As to your concerns about the strategic implications of threatening another nation's nuclear command and control and vice versa, that is very well understood. That is very well factored in as we think through the overall effects that we're trying to achieve. And I do want to put one more caution out in terms of when we tend to use terms, at least back at STRATCOM, and strategic stability, our basic definitions of strategic stability are probably out of date. They date back to the Cold War. They're two-party dynamics pieces. They tend to think of nuclear as the only major effect that has to be considered. When you move this into a three-party problem, it is a completely different set of effects, dynamics, that I think we need a lot of work to get into to understand how that works.
Thank you, sir. General Dickinson, in our ability to achieve and maintain a competitive edge in space, relies heavily on a rapid capability development and eliminating acquisition bottlenecks. Can you discuss how you're partnering with commercial and interagency organizations to expand our space capabilities at the pace that we need them to be expanded? And what steps have you taken to improve your acquisition process in order to onboard new capabilities at a faster pace?
So that's really been one of the highlights with the command over the last couple of years, is really the partnership we have with the commercial industry. Two examples of that. One is the two main areas that we work closest with the commercial partners right now, but we're expanding that, is satellite communications, and the other one is space domain awareness. Satellite communications capability with our commercial industry has really been out at Vandenberg Space Force Base for years, but has expanded. We've got 10 commercial partners right now as part of our commercial integration cell out at Vandenberg Space Force Base. And that's a great relationship in terms of how do we expand our capabilities and capacity in the satellite communications domain or enterprise, and how do we do that. The second one is space domain awareness, and really that's been a rather new, about a year and a half, 2 old. We've got a cell in Colorado Springs that works for my Joint Task Force Space Defense in a commercial integration cell that really what it does is it provides to us what commercial space domain awareness capabilities can see around the world. So they're looking in the space domain for us, telling us what they see, and we utilize that in addition to what we're doing with our exquisite sensors. So the integration of those two enterprises, space domain awareness and SATCOM, has been very, very powerful. It's growing so much now that we've had to develop a new commercial framework by which we can bring those partners on board and expand it even more.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Round. Senator Kane, please.
Thank you to each of you for your service. And Admiral Richard, let me begin with you. You talked about how some of our defense concepts are a little bit outdated in your realm because they were based upon kind of a two-party dynamic, and now we have to grapple with a three-party dynamic. I think it's even more complicated than that because 2 of the 3 parties are now cooperating in ways that they hadn't. I've often asked questions in this committee and in the Foreign Relations Committee about growing cooperation between Russia and China, and usually folks on your side of the table tell me that I don't need to worry about it much because there's so much historical animosity between Russia and China that they're not likely to cooperate. I think we're finding that actually not to be the case. Whatever the past is, they're cooperating a lot more now. So I'd like you to each tell the committee in your own domain, how are you planning to take into account the increasing cooperation between Russia and China in either the STRATCOM or SpaceCom areas?
Senator, first, I would want to say I'm not going to tell you that I'm not concerned about that. I'm very concerned about what opportunistic aggression looks like. I'm worried about what cooperative aggression looks like. And so, one, this gets back to I have to deter all of them all of the time, which means every day we're thinking about their decision calculus and what we have to do to influence so that basically they say not today. And so right now, you have to look at what's happening in one place and then walk over and see what that does to change decision calculus and change your messaging potentially, change your posture. And that's just in the opportunistic frame. And then do you have the plans ready to understand what cooperative looks like? So we do that every day, Senator.
Great. General Dickinson.
Senator, we look at it each and every day, just as Admiral Richard does. But in the space domain, we just have to look to see how much more capability development that they've done just on orbit. We can go back to November just to look at the Newdahl test, and then, as I mentioned in my opening statements, the SJ-21 in particular. So just individually, the growth of their capabilities on orbit is of concern. And then when you look at from the civil perspective, the Chinese and the Russians have entered into a lunar station agreement that they're going to build a station on the moon. So it's not just the military that we're looking at carefully, it's also kind of their civil piece as well by both of those nations.
General Dickinson, you've segued into my next question, the civil dimension. So there's been news recently that was sort of interesting news, kind of in a way positive news. Elon Musk has been getting some press for his role in providing ground stations and internet coverage to Ukraine with the Starlink satellite connection. So that's positive. Russia has been trying to jam the signals and block coverage. That's made me wonder, there are non-state actors in space too that can enter into contested environments. Describe the legal framework for commercial capability in space and to SpaceCom war game scenarios where private actors become involved in contested situations.
We do look at that, Senator, and really to begin with, I think what we're seeing with Elon Musk and the Starlink capabilities providing is really kind of showing us what a mega constellation or proliferated architecture can provide in terms of redundancy and capability. But to your point, though, we work very closely in our commercial integration cells with that very issue.
Admiral Richard, one last question for you. I met last week with General Von Ovest of Transcom, and we talked about future tanker requirements. It's my understanding that the airborne tankers that support the bomber leg of the triad have a varying degree of EMP, electromagnetic pulse hardening, to include the KC-46. So talk to us about STRATCOM's role in shaping requirements for future tanker programs to ensure that EMP hardening is part of the DNA.
Well, Senator, you hit on a key point as I'm one of the customers of the tanker fleet, and in that I have certain requirements, EMP protection, electromagnetic pulse being one of those. So one is to clearly articulate the requirements. Two is go see what we can do in terms of employment of our force to reduce that demand signal. A great example I'd point to, and I would give credit to the Air Force, is the re-engining of the B-52s. The engines on those date back to the 60s. They burn a lot of gas. Re-engine, less fuel required, less tanker demand. And then what other efficiencies can we achieve while still maintaining the flexibility and the signaling capability of the air leg, which is one of its prized possession or prized attributes.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Kane. Since a quorum is present, I would now ask the committee to consider the following civilian nominations. The Honorable Robert P. Storch to be Inspector General of the Department of Defense, Dr. Lester Martinez-Lopez to be Assistant Secretary of Defense for Health Affairs, Mr. Christopher J. Lohman to be Assistant Secretary of Defense for Sustainment, Mr. Peter Beshar to be General Counsel of the Department of the Air Force, the Honorable Frank R. Parker to be Assistant Secretary of the Navy for Manpower and Reserve Affairs, Dr. Agnes G. Schaefer to be Assistant Secretary of the Army for Manpower and Reserve Affairs, and Mr. Frank Calvelli to be Assistant Secretary of the Air Force for Space Acquisition. We have reviewed these nominations with Senator Inhofe, and he concurs. Is there a motion to favorably report these 7 nominations?
So moved.
Is there a second? Second. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
The motion carries. Thank you very much. And now let me recognize Senator Tillis, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, thank you for being here and for your service. Admiral Richard, with have you recognized any tangible operational changes resulting from Putin's announcement that they need to increase nuclear readiness? And have you seen any posture changes on the part of Russia or the PRC with respect to that?
Senator, I'd like to go into detail in that answer to that question inside the closed session, but if you'll allow me to make a broader point that I think relates. The scenarios that we are seeing right now, potential escalation, limited nuclear use in a conventional aggression scenario, STRATCOM has been preparing for this for years, along with other combatant commands. General Dickinson Command has been doing that. And so we have rewritten deterrence dynamics theory over the years. We have new analysis that we're using. We got criticized for that. We got told that it was highly improbable or somehow self-serving for us to think our way through this, but we ignored that such that to this point, nothing has happened that we didn't anticipate, we hadn't thought about, and hadn't prepared for.
Thank you for that. With Belarus indicating their willingness to have nuclear assets deployed within their territory, how does that rethink our forward deployed capabilities in Europe?
Senator, again, I respect your indulgence to allow me to answer that in closed session.
Thank you. General Dickinson, I want to talk a little bit about end strength. I think you're somewhere around 45% of goal, augmented by reserve, civilians, and Guard. But you're relatively new. So what's the right timeline to get up to the desired end strength, and what kind of strategies are you putting together to make sure that we get there?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Senator. So yeah, you're correct. We're 45–50% strength with an augmentation of contractors that get us up over, like I said in my opening statement, to about 1,000. So our strategy, quite frankly, is to get to the end strength as quickly as I can. We've worked with the department very carefully in terms of how do we bring manpower from certain fiscal years back to the left so that I can be at a reasonable strength here in a couple of years. But that is where we're going, and what we're trying to do right now is attract that talent that we need in the command, and that's both a balance between civilian as well as military. And in the civilian force that I have is Department of the Air Force civilians, and we're working very closely right now on how to attract them. We've got some programs out there in terms of internship programs to bring young adults into the command with STEM technical type of degrees, and I've been very pleased with the military presence that we've had within the commands from all the services. The two biggest services that I have represented in the command right now is, quite frankly, as you would expect, the Space Force and the Army. And so bringing them into a joint command, building them to full operational capability, utilizing exercises, and quite frankly, real-world operations. So we've had a couple of events over the last 3 years, if you will, that have really driven us to be very proficient in what we do. I'll just take the Newdall event, for example, back in November. That, for us, when I declared initial operational capability last August, was a direct result of having that talent and expertise within the command rehearsed through processes and procedures and techniques that the joint world knows and recognizes, to the point where we can actually provide a strategic effect for our national level leaders. That is really the strategy going forward. And right now we've got an initial operational capability, which means we can provide those effects, but we're building out the capacity within the command so that I can do that more robustly.
Do you have sufficient authorities to be able to get to where you need to be within strength or resources?
I do. I have the right authorities right now.
Admiral Richards, just really quickly, with advances, particularly with respect to China and hypersonics and other capabilities, is our current strategy mapping up against their emerging threats, or do we need to rethink maybe how we counter threats 10 years, 20 years from now differently?
Senator, I'm conscious of the fact that the Nuclear Posture Review and National Defense Strategies have not been promulgated, but I'm confident that we're going to have a good strategy. The question is going to be capability, capacity, and posture, and to acknowledge those will not be static, and we are going to have to think through those much more frequently than we've needed to in the past because of the very threats you're referring to.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Tillis. Senator Kelly, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Admiral Richard, and good morning to you both. Thank you for being here, Admiral General. Admiral Richard, we've all been following reports of Russian attacks on Ukrainian nuclear plants and other very concerning developments in this conflict. Russia is now targeting civilians, probably out of frustration. This should be, and I think is viewed as escalatory. It's clearly a war crime. I'm concerned about further escalation. And I understand the U.S. military has established a hotline or direct communication channel with the Russian military, particularly because Russian media and cyber actors have sought to spread disinformation, making reliable information hard to assess in real time. It's my view that this direct military-to-military communication is critical to avoid misunderstandings that could lead to a dangerous military escalation between two nuclear powers. As this committee knows well, in a crisis, decision time to respond to a nuclear threat is only a matter of minutes. Admiral Richard, I understand the hotline will be run out of U.S. European Command. Can you elaborate on how STRATCOM will remain in the communication loop of this hotline?
Hey, Senator, a couple of points, if I could. Actually, you don't have to respond to threats, nuclear or otherwise, in minutes. In fact, I'm not allowed to put the President in the position that he only has or her to minutes to respond. So I want to make sure everybody understands this nation always has the time to make a fully informed decision on any action that it takes. Second, for strategic purposes, we have long had hotlines between the United States and Russia. They date back to the Cold War. They're still there. They're tested every day. Those are still available to us. We are a long way from needing to use anything like that right now. And I will go into more detail on the rest of your questions in closed session, sir.
All right, thank you. And General Dickinson, we're currently, seeing reports of commercial satellite systems, very effectively, being used, information for the Ukrainians, also for us. And these satellite systems are, likely to be of interest to Russia too. And how should they ultimately counter them in the context of this invasion? And Russia's and China's anti-satellite capabilities have received a lot of attention in years with a couple anti-satellite tests, one before one of my space shuttle launches in around 2008. But I want to spend a little time today discussing Iranian and North Korean anti-satellite capabilities that tend to get less airtime, especially North Korea, who obviously has an intercontinental ballistic missile capability. Iran hopes to develop one. One concern is that ICBMs can be used to create a debris cloud in low Earth orbit, and that could impact U.S. satellites. General Dickinson, can you expand on how U.S. Space Command is viewing both the North Korean and the Iranian capabilities, and how do you assess their willingness to target and impact U.S. satellites in space?
Thank you, Senator. First of all, I would just say that you identify a big problem, if you will, within the space domain. We just saw it a couple of months ago when the Russians they conducted their Nudal test that left about 1,500 pieces of debris in low Earth orbit that quite frankly, we're tracking every day now, and we will continue to track that for years to come. To your example, back before your flight, when the Chinese did that test, we still track objects today from that very test that quite frankly, and sir, you're an expert on this, could be threatening to the International Space Station. And we do a lot of work each and every day very closely with NASA to make sure that we look at that and make sure that the astronauts on the International Space Station are safe. With regards to both Iran and North Korea, I would like to expand on that if I could in the closed session.
All right. Thank you, and yield back the remainder of my time.